A small-town mechanic fixed a stranger's car for free, unaware the man was a billionaire CEO. The thought had never crossed Jack Harmon's mind as he wiped the grease from his calloused hands that morning, the familiar scent of motor oil and rust hanging in the autumnal air of Miller's Creek. This tiny dot on the map, with its single blinking traffic light and family-owned storefronts, had been his whole world for all 42 years of his life. The rain tapped gently against the corrugated metal roof of Harmon's auto repair, a rhythm Jack knew by heart. It was the kind of sound that reminded him of childhood, of watching his father work beneath car hoods while he handed over tools with eager, smaller versions of the hands he now possessed. Hands that had fixed over 1,000 engines but couldn't repair what mattered most. Jack glanced at the framed photograph on his cluttered desk. Sarah and little Emma, their smiles frozen in time. 5 years since the accident, and still the sharp edges of grief hadn't completely dulled. He turned away, focusing instead on the invoice in front of him. Mrs. Peterson couldn't afford to pay the full amount for her transmission work, but her grandson needed rides to his cancer treatments in the city. Jack silently slashed the price in half, then crossed out the new figure and wrote payment plan instead. The bell above the shop door jingled, pulling Jack from his calculations. Rain blew in with a gust of wind, and with it, a stranger. Tall, salt and pepper hair, expensive coat soaked at the shoulders. Something about him seemed out of place in Miller's Creek, like finding a thoroughbred in a stable of workhorses. "Car trouble?" Jack asked, already reaching for a rag to wipe his hands. The man nodded, his shoulders tense with frustration. "Engine died about a mile back. I've got meetings in Cincinnati tomorrow morning that can't be rescheduled." Jack nodded. He'd heard urgency in 1,000 different voices over the years. "Let's take a look. Got a tow truck we can use." The stranger introduced himself simply as Richard, offering no last name as they drove in silence to where the sleek black Audi sat abandoned on the shoulder, raindrops sliding down its pristine surface like tears. Jack worked methodically under the hood, his weathered hands moving with the precision of a surgeon. Richard paced nearby, checking his phone repeatedly until the signal disappeared entirely. One of Miller Creek's many charms, cell service that vanished like morning mist. "Dead alternator," Jack finally announced. "And your timing belt's showing wear. You're lucky it happened here, and not halfway up the mountain pass." Richard ran a hand through his damp hair. How long will it take to fix?" "Parts will have to come from Lexington. 2 days minimum." The word minimum seemed to hit Richard like a physical blow. "That's not possible. I need to get to Cincinnati." Jack studied the man. Designer watch, tailored suit visible beneath the open coat, shoes worth more than Jack's monthly mortgage payment. But there was something else. A hollowness around the eyes, the slightly stooped posture of someone carrying an invisible weight. "Tell you what," Jack said, surprising himself. "I've got a rebuilt alternator that might fit. Not factory original, but it'll get you there. And my brother-in-law runs the Hillside Motel if you need a place for tonight." 3 hours later, hands numb from the cold rain, Jack closed the Audi's hood. The engine purred like it had just rolled off the assembly line. Richard stared at him, momentarily speechless. "What do I owe you?" Jack hesitated. Something about this man reminded him of himself. Not the clothes or the car, but the look of someone running from ghosts. "This one's on the house," he said finally. "I can't accept that. Parts and labor, that's hours of work. Pay it forward someday," Jack replied, handing over the keys. "World needs more of that." Richard's expression shifted, confusion giving way to something unreadable. "I don't understand." "Nothing to understand. Just helping a stranger in a tough spot." Jack glanced at the darkening sky. "You should get going if you want to make it through the pass before nightfall." After Richard drove away, Jack locked up the shop and walked the 3 blocks home to his empty house, the echo of his footsteps on the hardwood floors the only greeting. He didn't think much about the stranger with the expensive car. In a small town, you helped because that's what kept the community alive, not because you expected anything in return. He couldn't have known that as Richard Conrad, CEO of Conrad Innovations, drove through the mountain pass that evening, the man couldn't stop thinking about the mechanic with the kind eyes and work-worn hands who had asked for nothing in return. 6 months passed. Winter released its grip on Miller's Creek, giving way to a tentative spring. Jack's routine remained unchanged. Wake at 5, coffee and toast in silence, open the shop by 7, lose himself in the meditation of mechanical problems that, unlike life's messier issues, had clear solutions. The anniversary of the accident approached, April 17th. Jack found himself working longer hours, as if physical exhaustion might grant him a dreamless sleep. It never did. On a particularly busy Tuesday, with 3 oil changes and a brake job backed up, the bell above the door chimed. Jack didn't look up from the carburetor he was cleaning. "Be with you in a minute," he called. "Take your time," a vaguely familiar voice replied. Jack glanced up to find Richard standing there, wearing a casual button-down shirt and jeans that somehow still looked expensive. The Audi was parked outside, gleaming in the spring sunlight. "Car giving you trouble again?" Jack asked, wiping his hands. Richard shook his head. "No, it's running perfectly. I actually came to thank you properly." He looked around the shop, taking in the outdated equipment, the concrete floor stained with decades of oil. "Your alternator got me to my meetings on time. Saved a deal worth millions." Jack shrugged. "Glad it worked out." "I'd like to repay the favor," Richard said. "I own a technology company. We're expanding into green energy solutions for rural communities, and I think Miller's Creek would be perfect for our pilot program." Jack set down his rag. "Green energy? Miller's Creek is coal country, Mr. Conrad. Richard Conrad." He extended his hand. "And that's exactly why it's perfect. The mines have been closing. People need new opportunities." Jack shook his hand, the name tickling something in his memory. "Conrad? Wait, Conrad Innovations? The tech giant?" Richard nodded, a hint of discomfort flashing across his face. "The same. You're that Richard Conrad? The billionaire?" "I prefer entrepreneur," Richard said with a small smile. "But yes." Jack stared at him, remembering the rain, the broken-down Audi, the free repair. "Why didn't you say anything? Would it have changed how you helped me?" Jack considered this. "No, exactly." Richard's eyes crinkled slightly at the corners. "That's why I'm here. In my world, everything has a price tag. Everything's a transaction. But you helped me because..." He paused as if the concept was still foreign. "Because it was the right thing to do." Jack shifted uncomfortably. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Richard said firmly. "They wouldn't have. That's what I've realized." The conversation was interrupted by the ringing of Jack's ancient shop phone. He excused himself to answer it, but the moment he heard Maggie Peterson's trembling voice, his heart sank. "Jack, it's Joey. The treatments aren't working anymore. Doctor says..." Her voice broke. "We need to get him to that specialist in Chicago, but the insurance won't cover it. And my car's making that awful noise again. Bring it in, Maggie." "I'll check it out right away," Jack said, his mind already calculating what he could sell to help with Joey's treatment. The fishing boat, maybe. He hadn't used it since Sarah and Emma. He hung up, finding Richard watching him with quiet intensity. "Problem?" Richard asked. Jack hesitated, then shook his head. "Nothing that concerns you." Something in his tone must have given him away, because Richard tilted his head. "I'd like to hear more about your community while I'm here. Perhaps over dinner? I'm staying at the Hillside Motel again." Jack almost refused, but the thought of another evening alone with his memories made him nod instead. "Darlene's Diner. 6 o'clock. Only decent food in town." After Richard left, Jack couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that the universe was up to something. Billionaires didn't just appear in Miller's Creek. They especially didn't come back. Darlene's Diner hadn't changed its decor since 1978, a fact the owner mentioned with pride at least once to every customer. The vinyl booths were cracked but clean. The jukebox played only country music older than most of the waitstaff, and the coffee was strong enough to strip paint. Jack arrived at 6 on the dot, surprised to find Richard already there, chatting comfortably with Darlene herself. The entire diner was watching with poorly disguised curiosity. Strangers were uncommon enough, but strangers in casual clothes that still somehow scream money were practically unicorns. "Your friend here says you fixed his fancy car for free," Darlene said as Jack slid into the booth. "You going soft, Jack Harmon?" "Just doing my job," Jack replied, reaching for a menu he didn't need to read. "Your usual," Darlene asked, and when Jack nodded, she turned to Richard. "And for you, mister. Big city?" "Whatever Jack's having sounds perfect," Richard said. When Darlene left, Richard leaned forward. "Everyone seems to know you. Small town," Jack said simply. "They respect you." "That's more than knowing." Jack shrugged, uncomfortable with the observation. "Been here all my life. Fixed most of their cars at some point. And slashed your prices when they couldn't pay?" Richard asked quietly. "Like Mrs. Peterson?" Jack's eyes narrowed. "You've been asking about me?" "Just observant." The phone call seemed important. Jack stared down at his scarred hands. He didn't talk about his personal life. Not with the townspeople who already knew everything, and certainly not with billionaire strangers. But something about Richard's direct gaze broke through his usual reserve. Her grandson Joey, 8 years old. Leukemia. The words came out clipped, factual, as if that could diminish their weight. Sarah, my wife, she was teaching him piano before. Before the accident, Richard waited, sensing there was more. Joey needs a specialist in Chicago. Insurance won't cover it. Jack looked up. But we'll figure something out. We always do. Their burgers arrived, massive and accompanied by a mountain of fries. They ate in silence for a few minutes before Richard spoke again. Tell me about Sarah, he said gently. The fork froze halfway to Jack's mouth. No one in town mentioned Sarah or Emma anymore, not directly. They talked around the accident, referred to before and after, as if Jack's life was divided into two distinct eras, which of course it was. She was a music teacher at the elementary school. Jack said finally, piano mainly. Could have played professionally, but she loved teaching kids. Said there was nothing like the moment when music clicked for them. And Emma? A sharp pain lanced through Jack's chest. My daughter. She was 6. Had her mother's talent. He set down his fork. Why are you really here, Mr. Conrad? It can't be just to thank me for an alternator. Richard studied him for a long moment. When my car broke down, I was on my way to finalize the largest acquisition in my company's history. A deal worth billions. He took a sip of his water. I was also in the middle of a divorce. My third. Jack raised an eyebrow but said nothing. 3 ex-wives, no children, no real friends, just people who want something from me. Richard's expression turned distant. I have 14 homes around the world and haven't felt at home in any of them in years. Success comes with a price, Jack offered. No, Richard shook his head. That's what I told myself. But the truth is, I chose this. Chose work over relationships. Chose conquest over connection. He met Jack's eyes. Until you fixed my car for free, I couldn't remember the last time someone did something for me without an agenda. Jack shifted uncomfortably. It was just an alternator. It was kindness, Richard corrected. Pure kindness from a man who has every reason to be bitter about life. He leaned forward. You lost your family, yet you still help others without hesitation. I have everything money can buy, and I've forgotten how to be human. The conversation was veering into territory that made Jack uneasy. He changed the subject, asking about Richard's green energy project, and they spent the next hour discussing the potential impact on Miller's Creek. By the time they finished their coffee, Jack had to admit that Richard's plan could genuinely help the struggling town. I'll be here for a few days, scouting locations, Richard said as they stepped outside into the cool evening air. I'd appreciate a local's perspective, if you're willing. Jack hesitated, then nodded. I open the shop at 7, close at 6. Free after that. Perfect. Richard extended his hand. Thank you for dinner, Jack. You paid, Jack reminded him. For the food, yes. The conversation was priceless. As Jack walked home, he realized he'd spoken more about Sarah and Emma in one evening than he had in the last year. The familiar ache was there, but somehow less crippling than usual. Like a muscle that had seized up from disuse, finally stretching again. Painful, but with the promise of eventual relief. The next few days fell into an unexpected pattern. Richard would appear at the shop around closing time, and they would drive around Miller's Creek, looking at potential sites for Conrad Innovations' Green Energy Center. Jack was surprised by Richard's genuine interest in the town's history and its people. He asked thoughtful questions and actually listened to the answers, taking notes and occasionally making calls to his team back in New York. On Thursday, they visited the shuttered coal mine that had once employed half the town. As they stood at the chain-link fence, staring at the rusted equipment and crumbling outbuildings, Richard said, "This could be perfect. We could repurpose the existing structures, bring in solar arrays, create a training facility for new technologies. Most folks around here don't have the education for high-tech jobs," Jack pointed out. "But they could learn," Richard replied. "Your community has something more valuable than technical skills. Work ethic, resilience, loyalty." Jack studied him. "A week ago, I'd have said you were feeding me a line. Now I'm not so sure." Richard smiled. "Highest compliment you've paid me yet." As they drove back to town, Jack noticed they were passing the cemetery. Without thinking, he slowed down. "Mind if we stop for a minute?" He asked, the words out before he could reconsider. If Richard was surprised, he didn't show it. "Of course." Jack parked and led the way through the iron gates, past generations of Miller's Creek residents, to a quiet corner beneath a weeping willow. 2 headstones stood side by side, simple granite markers with names, dates, and the inscription, "Beloved Wife and Daughter." Jack knelt, brushing away some fallen leaves. "I come every Sunday," he said quietly. "Bring fresh flowers. Talk to them, though I don't know if they hear me." Richard stood respectfully a few steps back. What happened?" he asked softly. Jack stared at the dates on Emma's stone. 6 years wasn't enough. "Not nearly enough." "Drunk driver," he said finally. "They were coming back from Emma's piano recital. Hit them head on. Driver walked away without a scratch." His voice tightened. 18 months in county jail. Been out for 3 years now. Richard moved closer, placing a hand on Jack's shoulder. "I'm sorry. I used to dream about revenge," Jack admitted. "Thought about it every day for the first year. What I'd do if I ever ran into him." He touched Sarah's name, carved into the cold stone. But Sarah would have hated that. She believed in forgiveness, second chances. "And you," Jack stood up slowly. "I'm still working on it." They drove back to town in silence. When Jack pulled up in front of the motel, Richard turned to him. "Thank you for sharing that with me." Jack nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "Would you show me one more place tomorrow?" Richard asked. "Somewhere that was special to your family?" The request should have felt intrusive, but somehow it didn't. "There's a spot by the lake," Jack heard himself say. "We used to picnic there every summer." "I'd be honored," Richard said simply. That night, Jack dreamed of Sarah for the first time in months. Not the recurring nightmare of screeching tires and breaking glass, but Sarah as she had been in life. Laughing, her hands moving gracefully over piano keys, teaching Emma a simple melody. He woke with tears on his cheeks, but they weren't entirely from grief. Friday afternoon brought a scattered rain shower that cleared just before closing time, leaving the air fresh and the sunlight golden. Jack found himself checking the clock repeatedly, an unfamiliar anticipation building as 6 o'clock approached. Richard arrived precisely on time, as he always did. They took Jack's truck to the lake, following a narrow road that wound through pine forests before opening to a spectacular view of water reflecting the blue-gold sky. Jack parked near a small clearing with a weathered picnic table. "This was our spot," he said, leading Richard toward the water's edge. Emma loved to skip stones. Sarah would bring her guitar sometimes and we'd sing together. Badly, in my case. Richard smiled. "It's beautiful here." "Yeah." Jack picked up a flat stone and sent it skipping across the lake's surface. 1, 2, 3, 4 jumps before it disappeared. Emma could never get more than 2 skips. We practiced for hours. They stood in companionable silence, watching the sun begin its descent toward the mountains. "Jack," Richard said finally, "I need to tell you something." There was a weight to his voice that made Jack turn to study him. "I'm not here just to thank you or even to scout locations," Richard continued. "I came back because I couldn't stop thinking about what you did. Fixing my car for free, expecting nothing in return, and what it said about you as a person." Jack frowned. "I don't follow." Richard took a deep breath. "My company has been developing a medical technology division. One of our researchers has pioneered a new treatment for certain types of childhood leukemia. It's still experimental, but the results have been promising." Jack went very still. "Joey Peterson," Richard nodded. "I made some calls after our dinner. Joey's been accepted into the clinical trial. All expenses paid, including transportation and housing for his grandmother." Jack stared at him, speechless. "That's not all," Richard continued. "Conrad Innovations is definitely coming to Millers Creek. We're bringing 300 jobs, a training center, and a commitment to hire locally. The paperwork's already being processed." "Why?" Jack managed finally. "Why here? Why now?" Richard's expression softened. "Because a small-town mechanic fixed a stranger's car for free, and in doing so, he fixed something in me too." He looked out over the lake. "I've spent 20 years building an empire, Jack. Made billions, but somewhere along the way, I lost the part of myself that remembered what matters." Jack shook his head, overwhelmed. "This is too much." "It's not charity," Richard said firmly. "It's investment in a community with heart, in people who understand that we're all connected." He turned to face Jack directly. "And I have a personal request too." What's that?" Jack asked warily. "I need someone to run the Millers Creek operation. Someone the town trusts who understands both the technical side and the human element." Richard held his gaze. "I want it to be you." Jack let out a disbelieving laugh. "I'm a mechanic, not a businessman. You're a problem solver, a leader, and the most genuine person I've met in years." Richard's expression was earnest. "My company needs what you have, Jack. Heart, integrity, purpose." Jack turned away, staring at the water as it caught the last golden rays of sunlight. The offer was absurd, impossible, and yet he felt something stirring within him that he hadn't felt in years. Purpose, hope, a future extending beyond mere existence. "I need time to think," he said finally. "Of course." Richard handed him a business card. "My private number. Call me when you decide." As they walked back to the truck, Jack paused to pick up another flat stone. He waited in his palm for a moment, then handed it to Richard. "Ever skipped stones before?" Richard shook his head. "Never had the opportunity." "It's all in the wrist." Jack demonstrated the motion. "Try it." Richard mimicked the movement and sent the stone across the water. One skip before it sank. Jack smiled. "Not bad for a first try." "I'll need more practice," Richard said, selecting another stone. Yeah," Jack replied, watching the billionaire CEO concentrate on the simple childhood skill with complete seriousness. "I think we all do." April 17th dawned clear and bright, the 5th anniversary of the accident. Jack woke early, as he always did on this day, and drove to the cemetery with fresh flowers. But this time, as he knelt before the graves, his words were different. "I think I'm ready," he told Sarah and Emma softly. "Ready to live again, not just exist. There's this opportunity." He explained about Richard, about Conrad Innovations, about the chance to help transform Miller's Creek. A gentle breeze rustled the willow branches above him, sending a shower of new spring leaves spiraling down. One landed on Emma's headstone, bright green against the gray granite. Jack touched it gently. "I'll always miss you both," he whispered. "Always love you, but I think it's time for me to honor your lives by living mine." Later that morning, he called Richard. "I'll do it," he said without preamble. "On one condition." "Name it," Richard replied. "The training center. I want it named after my wife. Sarah Harmon Center for Technology Education." His voice caught slightly. She was the real teacher in the family. There was a moment of silence on the other end. "It would be an honor," Richard said finally, his own voice thick with emotion. 1 year later, Jack stood on a podium beside Richard Conrad as they cut the ribbon on the Sarah Harmon Center. The crowd of Millers Creek residents cheered, none louder than Joey Peterson, now in remission and excited about the computer coding classes he would take when the center opened. Afterward, as people milled about the reception, Richard pulled Jack aside. "I never properly thanked you," he said. Jack raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "You're the one who transformed this town." Richard shook his head. "For showing me what wealth really is." He gestured around them, at the community celebrating its rebirth. "When my car broke down, I was the richest man in the room by bank account, but the poorest in every way that matters." Jack thought about the past year, the challenges of learning a new industry, the satisfaction of seeing former miners find purpose in sustainable energy work, the gradual healing that came with focusing on something larger than his grief. He thought of Richard, who now kept a small apartment in Millers Creek and had become a genuine friend, not just a boss. "We helped each other," Jack said simply. Richard smiled. "That's what community is, isn't it?" What I'd forgotten until a small-town mechanic fixed a stranger's car for free. As the sun set over the revitalized town, casting long golden shadows across the new solar arrays where coal tipples once stood, Jack felt Sarah and Emma's presence more strongly than he had since the accident. Not as ghosts of the past, but as guiding lights illuminating a future he was finally ready to embrace. A future built on a simple act of kindness that had transformed not just a town, but the hearts of everyone it touched.